Welcome to the Brontë Festival of Women's Writing. So fantastic to see you all here this evening. It's the 12th anniversary of the Brontë Festival of Women's Writing, and this year we're celebrating nature and art and everything to do with sustainability and well-being. So it's so fantastic to have you here. The second shout out is just to our marketing officer, Carla. Happy birthday, Carla. And yeah, thank you so much. We're going to start off this festival with an amazing panel of speakers who all write about nature in very different ways, and chaired by someone who loves nature and writes about it as well. So it's a perfect blend of all of these brilliant women. So without further ado, let's welcome our Women on Nature panel.
Welcome everybody, it's really lovely to meet you. So my name's Anna Childers, and I'm a writer as well, but tonight it's nothing to do with me, it's about these four lovely women who are sitting with me. So what we're going to do is I'm going to introduce them to you in a moment, and then I'm going to ask them various questions, we're going to have some chats, and each of them is going to give us a little reading as well from their work. And then at the end there'll be time for questions from you. So if you've got questions you'd like to ask any of them, we'll have sort of 10 to 15 minutes at the end for that. So first of all, I'm just going to introduce them. So we have Anita Sethi, who is a writer whose book I Belong Here was shortlisted for the Wainwright Prize, and it was also chosen as the Guardian Literary Highlight of 2021. We have Catherine Norbury, who is the editor of Women in Nature, an anthology, which is a beautiful fat book with just so many different writers in it. And she's also the writer of The Fish Ladder, which is both memoir and nature writing. Monica Radiovic is a poet who won Stormzy's I'm getting muddling my words up here. The New Writers' Prize with her collection Teeth in the Back of My Neck. And Claire O'Callaghan is the Victorian literature scholar and expert on Emily Brontë, whose book Emily Brontë Re-Appraised was published in 2018. So welcome to all of these writers, and I'm really looking forward to talking to them for the next hour. So the first question I'm going to ask all of these writers, because we're here obviously in Haworth, we're thinking about the Brontes. Brontë vibes are all around us. So the first question I'd like to ask each of them is, what is your favourite Brontë novel, if you have one? It's a very difficult question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So I'm going to start this question with Anita. So Anita, do you have an answer to that?
It's so difficult to choose just one. It's like choosing between your favourite child or something. But the first one I fell in love with as a teenager was Jane Eyre. I remember being transported from like inner city Manchester out into the wild and windy moors, and really relating to that sense of outsiderness as well, and the loneliness and also the beauty of nature. Also love Wuthering Heights, helped by also Kate Bush song Wuthering Heights. I'd also like to give a shout out to the undersung Anne Brontë, Tenant of Wildfell Hall. I think she's so overlooked, and actually I recently reread her books, and I think she's wonderful as well.
So you've actually given us all of them.
Three, yeah. I told you it's impossible to choose.
Yeah, it is absolutely. Yeah, thank you. Okay.
We can't actually hear it though.
Okay, well we'll try and talk a bit louder.
Is this actually on?
I don't think that's a mic for the room. I think that's for the
right. We'll try and talk louder. Sorry about that.
Okay, Kate, have you got an answer?
I have got an answer, which is embarrassingly similar to Anita's answer. I do think The Tenant of Wildfell Hall is an absolutely extraordinary book. And of course, Wuthering Heights has captured my imagination as a teenager. But for me, I have to land fairly and squarely on Jane Eyre by Charlotte Brontë, which I think I must have read it 10 times. My mum probably read it 30 times. And it's just been a part of my life from a very, very early age, for all the reasons that you've specified and more. I was an adoptee. I came into a family that was not my own, and that feeling of being the outsider who doesn't quite fit, but likes being outside, was very resonant.
Yeah. Absolutely, thank you. Okay, Monica.
I think definitely Wuthering Heights for me, mostly because of the description. Like the Moors were basically a character in of itself, and having grown up in a city, it was just completely sort of like alien from anything I had ever been familiar with. So I was very, very afraid of the book, but also obsessed with it. So yeah, definitely Wuthering Heights.
Okay, fantastic. And Claire.
Oh, it's impossible, as you said. It's like picking your favourite child.
Favourite sweets, even.
Yes. I go through phases. It can change on a monthly basis which one I'm drawn to. But I have a real soft spot for Shirley, which is Charlotte Bronte's most unloved, probably the least read, arguably the most hated Brontë novel. And partly the reason I love it is because Charlotte fictionalises Emily in it. Got a really good, through Shirley, the character Shirley is based on Emily. I think she said it would be how Emily was in riches and health, and she captures Emily with her dog through that figure of Shirley, and I just love that. I'm really drawn to it.
That's fantastic. So she actually said that it was based on Emily herself.
That comes out in some of their letters, yeah.
And did she write it after Emily had died?
She starts writing it, in the turbulent time when Bramwell and the other family are beginning to be sick, and then she finishes it after all her siblings have died. Right. So it contains a lot of pain, I think, in some ways. Yeah. But it's also a tribute in that sense.
So although you're an expert on Emily, your favourite Brontë novel is by Charlotte. Well,
like I said, I wouldn't want to be pinned down to that, but I've got a soft spot for it. But yeah, for today.
Yeah, it's interesting. I used to work at the library in Halifax, and we did a survey of all the library users. What is your favourite book? Not your favourite Brontë book, your favourite book of everything. And the top two by a mile were Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights. Yeah. I think Jane Eyre was the winner, but they were close. Yeah. So you're an expert on Emily Brontë, and you've written this wonderful book about Emily, and you've written about there's a lovely chapter in there about Emily and nature, and I think you've said that you feel that Emily is very modern in her attitude to nature. Could you say something more about that?
Yeah, I mean, she's out kind of walking and observing the landscape and seeing changes, and even though it's not so much in Wuthering Heights, because Wuthering Heights is a bit of a magic trick. You think there's lots of stuff on the moors, but there's actually not very much on the moors. There's references to the moors, but there isn't actually much set on the moors at all. But if you look at Emily's poetry, you get a real sense of how attuned she is to nature and how observant she is. And also in her art, most of the surviving artwork that we have of Emily's, by and large, are of animals and wildlife. And some of that she's copied from other books, but others are things like a beautiful painting she did of a Merlin, for example, that I was really lucky. It was reproduced in my book. And you can see the attention to detail, and if you ever get to see it on display in the Parsonage, which it isn't very often, you can see that the Merlin's eyes are striking. It's really alive. So yeah, she's very observant, and I think that kind of attention to nature, focus on nature, seeing how the world changes around her is something we're very attuned to today, more so I think than in previous generations. We're so aware of the environment and climate change and destruction and how nature unfolds, and Emily was very much of that kind of spirit.
Yeah. I mean, I was really struck when I read that chapter about how you present Emily as somebody who was striding out on the moors of and the joy she had in it, and with her dog, because all of them died so young. You sometimes in these pictures make them look quite frail, don't they? But but that's not what she was like.
No, she's one of those. She's often described. She's the tallest Brontë, and she was described as being very slender anyway before she got ill. But I imagine that part of that is a slight athleticism from the miles she put in. Got under her belt really. And yeah, she's there's lots of descriptions of her kind of walking off, striding off onto the moors with Keeper, her mastiff. And that was where she really enjoyed herself as well. And like I say, if you read the poetry, the moors, the environment, nature, walking on them, being in them, feeling it, even moments of like the wind being tangling your hair are all captured in that verse.
I'm really interested in what you said about there not being much of the moors in Wuthering Heights, because that's what everybody always says about it.
I know.
They love it because of the moors. Yep. So can you, how is that?
Yeah. It's the most clever literary magic trick of all time, I think. So obviously it starts with this strange man turning up at somebody else's house who's a tenant and asking for shelter because there's this huge storm outside. But once he gets in and we have the story unfold, I mean, he's in a house that for most of the novel listening to a story, but then the narrators, Nellie, and then this guy Lockwood, they're just moving between two properties. It's very insular. She kind of turns the lens in. There are references to Heathcliff and Cathy running off onto the moors in the day, and there are scenes later in the novel that are out. The book ends, with a vision of the moors. But most of the narrative is actually inside houses. It's in a domestic space. I suspect, though, thanks to kind of contemporary Hollywood, the image of the lovers on the moors sitting on the hilltop, that's what people have in their mind. But actually, when you go to the book, it's far less than you might imagine.
It's really interesting, isn't it? Yeah, really a magic trick.
Yeah.
So, have you got something you'd like to read to us from your book?
Yeah. So I'm gonna read about Emily being on the moors. So this is from a part on nature. And what I'm going to do, I'm doing a bit of a mashup here. So I'm going to read a paragraph, but I actually want to jump then to reading a poem, which is about her observations of nature. It's about her love in December and nature in December, but we'll get there. So a visit to Haworth today will give you a very different Haworth to the one Emily Brontë lived in during the 19th century. Today, the Parsonage is an extended museum dedicated to remembering the lives and works of the Brontës, and it's sat amidst a bustling tourist industry devoted to its literary antecedents. Originally, though, the Parsonage was a 9-roomed Georgian house with a stark graveyard at its front that, in Emily's day, stood atop of the town in isolation, straddled between the town centre and the rugged moorland, and exposed to the elements from every angle. As any northern inhabitant knows, the Yorkshire climate changes the landscape from season to season, day to day, transforming the locale from a cold, blustery landscape in winter to a beautiful purple idyll in summer. But no matter what the weather, Emily insisted on going outdoors. Locals often remember her walking with her dog, whistling to keep her, and taking long strides over the rough earth. And parishioners in the church beside her home recalled her viewing her through their windows, heading off onto the rugged terrain. It's Emily's relationship with nature and her walks on the moors where she found the solitude that she craved. So it's apt that Charlotte described her as a solitude-loving raven. What she said was, "My sister Emily loved the moors. Flowers brighter than the rose bloomed in the blackest of the heath for her. Out of a sullen hollow in the lived hillside her mind could make an Eden. She found in the bleak solitude many and dear delighted, and not the least and best love was liberty." So the poem I'm going to read, and I apologise for anyone that's ever heard me read this, I love reading this poem because it's one of my favourite Emily poems, is a poem about December. She writes it in 1838, and it's a kind of invitation to see beauty in a bleak, wintry landscape. And you'll notice that at one point she invites you to come and join her. It's called How Still, How Happy, and it goes like this. How still, how happy. Those are words that once would scarce agree together. I loved the plashing of the surge, the change in heaven, the breezy weather, more than smooth seas and cloudless skies, and solemn, soothing, softened airs that in the forest woke no sighs, and from the green spray shook no tears. How still, how happy. Now I feel where silence dwells is sweeter far than laughing's mirth's most joyous swell, however pure its raptures are. Come, sit down on this sunny stone. 'Tis wintry light over flowerless moors, but sit, for we are all alone, and clear expand heaven's breathless shores. I could think in the withered grass, spring's bud in wreaths we might discern, the violet eyes might slyly flash, and young leaves shoot among the fern. It is but thought. Full many a night the snow shall clothe these hills afar, and storm shall add a drearer blight, and winds shall wage a wilder war before the lark may herald in fresh foliage twinned with blooms fair, and summer days again begin their glory haloed crown to wear. Yet my heart loves December's smile as much as July's golden beams. Then let us sit and watch the while the blue ice curdling on the stream.
Okay, I'm going to ask everybody another question now. So the question is, is there a particular place where you always feel comfortable? I'm going to ask Kate first.
Comfortable. Probably the Llyn Peninsula, a place called Tudweliog, in North Wales, a little beach that I have spent many hours on over the last sort of 20 years or so.
Fantastic. Yeah. And then that sort of familiarity of a place can be what brings that comfort, can't it?
Yes, although I think the word comfort is a really difficult one, because I think whenever we're in an environment that is not the place that is home, there are always the tensions. But certainly in North Wales at the moment, there are great tensions between the English and the Welsh in that space. And so I'm comfortable in the place, but when the place is peopled, there are tensions that are always there. So comfort, I think, is a well chosen, but actually a very complicated word.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Anita, you got?
Yeah, I'm not sure there is anywhere I feel entirely comfortable all the time.
Sorry, I just didn't.
I'm not sure there is a place that I feel comfortable in all the time. I think there's moments that I draw comfort from nature when I'm out. Can everyone hear? By the way, yeah. So yeah, there's a place called Settle in the Yorkshire Dales, and when I was walking through the Pennines, that's where I was starting to think about ideas of places that make you feel settled and comfortable. I guess I draw moments of comfort when I'm in nature, particularly where I love walking near water, near rivers, and even in a local park.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Anita. And Claire, do you think that there was a place where Emily Brontë, where she felt comfortable? Was there a place that she went to?
Yeah, I mean, she's famous for obviously being quite a home lover, and obviously the Parsonage across the way is clearly where she felt really, really safe. But I think she felt most at home and special, kind of picking up on what you just said, Anita, probably out there, and that idea of kind of walking around by the water. There's a really lovely description of, it was made by the Bronte's friend Ellen Nussey many years after the fact, where she was talking about the Brontes in childhood and how they would walk. On the walk to Top Withens, there's the waterfall and the bridge, the Bronte Bridge, and she gives a really lovely description of how the children would all walk there. They'd all walk there together, and she recalls Emily with her hands, playing with her hands in the water and playing with tadpoles and just enjoying herself. And I get the sense that they're out there on the moors is home versus the moors. So different, but I suspect she was torn between the two.
Thank you. And Monica, is there a place that you feel particularly comfortable?
I think that's a really interesting question for me specifically, because I am Brazilian and Montenegrin, born in London, and so the concept of home is quite complicated and nebulous for somebody like me. But I thought the way you phrased the question was so interesting, because a lot of what I write about is kind of questioning that feeling of home and being comfortable, especially as somebody who lives with chronic pain. So actually, like literally speaking, no, there is nowhere that I feel comfortable or that feels like a home, because no matter where I am, I feel out of place in some form. But I guess when I feel most comfortable is when I'm doing something that like aligns very deeply with my creative practice, whether that's writing or being immersed in other people's creativity. That's kind of when I feel like all of that stuff can kind of float away a little bit. So I guess mine isn't a place, but sort of abstract state of being.
In the activity.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And in some of your poems, you write a lot about being in the body, and so does to you a body feel like a place to be? I mean, could you say anything about that?
Yeah, of course. I mean, to me, a body is deeply political, and it is a canvas with which many things are kind of projected onto that canvas, and then it is the owner of that body's responsibility or weight to carry around for the rest of their lives. So to me, I'm like endlessly fascinated with the body as, you know, as a place of violence or a place of worship or a place of safety, or all of these things kind of mixed up together. And I'm also fascinated with how gendered that is as well. For women, like women's bodies are politicized and kind of picked apart and medicalized and or denied in so many different ways, and in really horrible ways. And that's why I end up drawn to it as a source. And also, as I've mentioned, I always, when I write and I'm trying to write about things that I find painful, sort of emotionally or intellectually, my instinct is to write from the perspective of a body, because I'm used to feeling pain in my body. So that is how I make sense of it. And that is how I make sense of kind of emotional anguish. I'm currently actually, for the first time, deviating away from poetry into short stories and a novel. And for the short stories in particular, the body is sort of the hyper-focus of the collection. Again, basically for the same reasons that I've just said, that I'm kind of endlessly fascinated with the way that we talk about our bodies, the way that we legislate against our bodies, the way that we prioritize some over others. I could go on, so I won't.
That's really interesting. I'm very excited about the short stories.
Thank you.
That'd be brilliant. And I think in some of the poems as well, you're writing about women's bodies, as you just said, and about sort of how we are natural. You know, we are part of nature and the natural functions of our bodies, and how maybe for women particularly that is covered or pushed away.
Yeah, I'm very interested in, first of all, there's a whole kind of ideology or a whole intellectuality around ecofeminism and I think there are parts of that are, you know, worth questioning, but some of that is very, very interesting in this idea of, because women or, you know, people with wombs are the ones giving birth, often their understanding and connectivity to nature is often seen as instinctive, and so that can play out in really interesting ways, whether that's, you know, women are judged a lot more harshly when it comes to motherhood or parenting, for example, because they are seen to have these innate instincts, or the other way around, that women are judged because they don't seem to have those instincts, they don't seem to be as deeply connected to nature. But so I find it's almost like two sides of the same coin, and I find it very beautiful, because I think there are I've been in spaces before where women are connecting with nature in ways that feel very deeply rooted to who they are and their experiences in their bodies. But other times there are really fascinating times of where women reject those kind of innate connections to nature, and again, like that plays out in things like witchcraft, and the idea of a wild woman is often a woman who is somehow, there's some kind of spiritual deviant connection to the other, or to like the underworld or something. I think all of that ties into actually how afraid we are of the power of women, and how that plays out in kind of every aspect of society.
Yeah, thank you. That's really powerful words.
Thank you.
Would you like to read something from your book?
Yes, I'm actually I decided on a whim to read a flash fiction, which is from my new collection. So this is the first time that I've read it, so bear with me. It'd be nice if I make a mistake. But this is called Blood-Ridden with Little Use for Vocal Cords. She was born fierce, with a pair of wings. But the problem was that they would not could not pull her out of there. And that was the only thing she wanted. So, somewhere along the way, she sold them. She traded them for vocal cords to sing with and managed to string together notes as mesmerizing and light-filled as glass beads that looped around the neck. Now, no one knew it, but she sang the sun into the sky in the mornings and charmed it into strengthening the crops. And for a while, she was happier. Alas, the village men accused her of being too pleased with herself, too loose, enjoying the breeze on her skin just a little too much. They sewed her mouth shut one sticky morning, limbs rope-tied, the skin on them torn up from the struggle. So, blood-ridden and with little use for vocal cords, she bartered them for gills, hoping to dive into deeper, colder, murkier waters. She found, to her bloodied delight, that she could see and breathe much better down there. And so she started digging up pearls that were fatter and more luminescent than anybody else's. She worked so very hard, salt crystals forming along the stitches on her mouth. And a pull in the base of her stomach began to tell her she just hadn't quite been ready for the places her wings could take her to. So, she started selling the pearls with the intention of buying back those wings. And for a while, she was happier. Alas, the oyster shuckers of the village became angered by the ethereal quality of her pearls, outshining the rest of them. And one day, they surrounded her and sliced her gills off with their sea daggers, the salt burning the wounds, and she could not even cry for help. They threw the gills, now browning and withered, back at her feet, and so she had little choice but to trade them for something else. The question was, what now? It took longer this time, and she grew emaciated and embittered. She traded her gills for a set of teeth. Now, not the kind of teeth you and I eat with. No, something far more sinister. She traded her gills for a set of teeth that looked like the stalactites adorning the mouth of a cave. Very beautiful, yes, but also quick to anger. She stole a sea dagger from those oyster shuckers, retreated to a cave overlooking the village, and sliced the rusting threads muzzling her mouth. She felt the beads of blood well up from the punctures dotting her lips and let her tongue savor the taste of it. The process of inserting these teeth were unbelievably easy. There was no pain. Even the holes ripped into her mouth flesh stopped dripping. And for a while, she was not happier per se, but no longer grieving. She pulled fish from the waves and ate them right there and then like a wild thing, and drank the salt from the sea like it could douse something, but it was not quite enough. She got hungrier and hungrier, and slowly anger lodged in her gut like a fish bone and set the lining of her stomach on fire. It started to send smoke up her throat, and at night she struggled to breathe from the heat. She watched the village heave and stretch beneath her like molasses, and her teeth strained forward in yearning, as if leashed, as if that leash decayed and frayed with every single pull. She was so very hungry. She was born fierce, with a pair of wings, but somewhere along the way she sold them. The problem was that they could not pull her out of there. Thank you.
Okay, that was amazing. Thank you. And it's such a privilege to be the first to hear it like that. Thank you very much. Okay, so the next question I'm going to ask all of our panellists, and I'm going to come to you first, Monica, for this one, is do you have a childhood memory of an encounter with nature that you could share with us?
Yes, I do. I remember this very distinctly. It was over 10 years ago, and I was a teenager and in Brazil, which is a country that I love dearly but don't get to go back to very often for various reasons. And I had gone somewhere with two friends of mine, very old friends, and we were in a natural hot spring. So we were in this beautiful natural hot water at night. And I remember lying on my back in the water and looking up at the sky. And for those of you who might not be familiar, the sky in Brazil is just like one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. When you're away from the light pollution, the stars and the kind of the entire world that you see there is unbelievable. So I remember putting my head under the water, like all my ears in the water, and so you could just hear this like rushing sound of the natural hot springs and see this like vast, like infinite sky above you that had like millions and millions and millions of stars. And I think I felt, I looked it up on the train here because I was trying to understand what that feeling was, and I think it's called the sublime, where it's that feeling of you are sort of terrified and awestruck and amazed by nature, and you sort of realize how small and tiny and useless you are in the kind of grand scheme of things. And it is both a beautiful feeling and a very scary feeling. And I've never forgotten that. And I have tried to recreate that moment several times, and it has never quite succeeded.
Oh, thank you for sharing that. That's fantastic. Yeah, it's lovely. Claire, have you got any? Are there any stories of childhood encounters that the Brontes had that you'd like to share with us with nature?
Yeah, I mean, the one I suspect that stuck with them is there's a story of in the 1820s, a bog burst out on the moors, which Patrick, their father, went on to write about and talked about, where it was basically thought it was an earthquake happening, and it wasn't, but it felt like an earthquake, and the kind of land blew up, and the children, including Emily, all had to take refuge in Pondon Hall, and he couldn't find the children and thought they were lost in this kind of earthquake. And it's something that I suspect that they returned to and probably talked at length about as an experience, because wow, what a terrifying experience. And certainly one of her later poems that's kind of called High Waving Heather is often said to be about that experience, and that it often stayed with her. So yeah. Okay,
thank you. That's really interesting. Some quite dramatic encounters. Yeah. Thank you. Kate, is there something in your memory that you'd like to share?
Yes, I was going back and sort of trying to work out what is my earliest memory of being consciously aware of the natural world beyond my domestic, largely interior life that children experience. And it would have been climbing Scawfell in Cumbria, or walking up Scawfell in Cumbria with my dad, probably with my whole family, but I think I was about 8. And I remember having two thin-soled plimsolls, you know, those black ones that you just used to pull on with a little bit of elastic. And the route up Scawfell used to be through something called Lord's Rake, which is a very narrow sort of ladder up through the rock. It's almost like 3 staircases up through the rock. And to find it, you can find it in mist, and on this day it was heavy, heavy mist, and it was that sense of the incredible whiteness, silence, ear-stopping, eye-stopping, not being able to see anything, holding Dad's hand, the cold, the wetness on my skin because of being effectively in a cloud, and then this huge sort of ocean liner-like wall of rock appearing on the right, because the route into Lord's Rake is you just head to the left, you keep heading to the left, and there's a huge sort of rock face, and then you find there's a little entrance into it, almost like a doorway, with a cross marked in the rock where 4 climbers had fallen to their death. It was the same place where Coleridge did his first ever rock climb, except he came the other way and came down it. Well, they came down it, but faster than they intended. But it was that early memory of being surrounded by that sort of whiteness, and then suddenly this black wall of wet, dripping rock, and the sound, the incredible sound of just condensation, I suppose, and being overwhelmed by.
Thank you. These are wonderful sensory experiences that everybody's giving us. Anita?
Yeah, I remember being a small child growing up in Manchester, and in the garden, which kind of curved around our house, which was on a very busy crossroads. I remember when my mum started, who had depression at the time, started cultivating the garden and planted a bulb, and I had no understanding of what a bulb was, but I helped her kind of dig through the soil and plant this kind of tiny little thing with no understanding of that something might one day grow from it. And then I remember it got bitterly cold that winter. It was just happened to be warm enough to actually plant something. Then it was a bitterly cold winter, and I remember then first seeing a daffodil grow from that bulb and understanding the magic of the seasons and something growing from nothing, as it were, and the power of, and it just became a symbol of hope for me that something can grow from nothing. And I understood the power of the passing seasons and the fact that if each of us plants one bulb, then we can be communally powerful, as it were.
Yeah, and that's a wonderful story to tell as well. I mean, that idea of like not wondering what your mother was doing and then sort of seeing it appear out of the earth, that must have been so special. Thank you. So you grew up in the city.
Yeah.
So obviously there is nature in the city, but it's maybe harder to find or harder to relate to. Have you got? Would you like to say anything about your experiences of nature in the city?
Well, we kind of think about nature and writing about nature as being, vast mountains, far off places, and epic journeys, which of course it is. It's all of those things. But I'm also interested in writing about nature, which is the micro as well as the macro. So looking out for, we all learned in lockdown how important nearby nature is, nature on the doorstep, learning to find wonder and beauty in kind of the dandelions growing between the cracks in the pavement, for example, or a local park. And so I think that it's hugely important that we have trees in cities and urban areas, that we deal with kind of pollution in cities, that every child growing up in urban areas has access to nature, as well as protecting nature in the countryside.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. And you've written about, you went, I think as a child, out into the Lake District from Manchester. So how did that, if you were used to living in a city, how did that feel going out?
Oh, actually, yeah, I did have that trip to the Lake District when I was a small child, which stayed with me. But actually, when I became a teenager, about 13, I remember getting the train here. I got the train from Manchester Victoria to Hebden Bridge and then got the Brontë bus here. And it just reminded me of being a teenager when I'd actually sometimes Skype school and do that. And then at Skype school, kind of sneak out, go to Manchester Victoria and just get the train up to like Todmorden, around here as well. It's just, I got such a thrill out of it. It was wonderful. Felt like I was escaping. I just loved walking in the hills. And that book, The Magic Faraway Tree by Enid Blyton, yes. It felt like I'd gone up and had found like another world. I was like, love walking in the hills. So I do celebrate nature in the city, but I do also think that everyone should be able to have access to the wonders of where we are now, the hills and the beauty of the peace of nature up here. Up here, it does feel like up here on top of the world.
Fantastic. So you contributed to the book that Kate put together, Women in Nature, which I'm going to talk to Kate about in a minute. I think are you going to read something from that?
Yeah, I've got a very tiny micro pieces to read because I know we don't have much time. So it's kind of a mashup of 3 tiny extracts from my piece, which is themed around flight. It's called Flight: Perspective on Nature in the City. A ladybird spread its wings wide and then vanished against the concrete of the school playground in Russia in Manchester. I had been peering intently at the tiny patch of beauty on the grey earth and felt a fluttering within at the sudden emptiness. Then I inspected the grey concrete for another little spot of redness. I would find another ladybird, I knew, for they clung to the bush at the edge of the playground, beyond which the great beast of a city roared all day long. The ladybirds crawled out into the greyness every now and then, and the children put their palms onto the ground so that the ladybirds tickled their heartlines. I liked looking at the ladybirds, their intricacies. It helped in this great blur of a crowded city into which I had been born to focus. A ladybird was fluttering through my mind at 8:30 one morning as I sat nibbling the soggy edges of the Weetabix. They were the most beautiful thing about my new school. The first time I saw one opening its wings wide, I thought it was dying the way its body seemed to be splitting open, but then it flapped about in the air, dived back down and became again a small oval solid thing, So still, unmoving, that the first time I ever saw one, I didn't know it was a living creature and thought it might have been some kind of colourful pebble, until it flew. And then just flash forwarding. Flight number 2. I sat on the top shelf of a row of shelves against the far wall in my grandmother's corner shop, which we called Mama Shop, delivered there by my dad's shoulders, nearby the display window and nestled between boxes of Kellogg's cornflakes no bigger than myself. While Mum was at work, we sometimes stayed at Mama Shop, which curved around a corner of Stretford, Manchester, nearby the Lancashire cricket ground. From this vantage point, I saw for the first time the tops of the houses, the chimneys puffing out smoke. I could see much further than I had ever seen before. I could see the clouds and their silver linings, the birds now level with my own new height. Before, I had no idea what lay beyond our city, but now, after a family trip to the Lake District, I peered towards the horizon. Perhaps I could catch a glimpse of the lakes if I looked closely enough, and although I could never see them, I could still think of them lying out there beyond sight, still there. I was above it all. One day I had been gazing out into the sky and had noticed swirls of birds there swooping and diving in a pattern in the rich sunset over the chimneys. They would swoop together, and so they were a tight mass of dark wings, and then dive outwards, separating, and I was in awe at the symmetrical pattern that they would make. The birds are getting ready to migrate to Africa, said Dad, when he caught me looking at them, the opposite journey to the one I did, from Africa to get there, and before that India. The autumn leaves had fallen fast that year, layering the park across the road with a thick coating of copper, which shone before turning into a grey mush by the rain. The birds each year flee from the cold and fly to warmer places, explained Dad, except for the pigeons who don't migrate. The pigeons stay put in their hometown and are made of thicker skins. We humans would have to remain behind too, and instead wear more layers of thick clothes to survive the bitter winter when it came. Just flash forwarding to the final paragraph. That night as I lay in bed, back in my own bedroom, I became a bird soaring high above the houses, a bird looking down upon these houses, able to see the whole picture. I looked down on my own bedroom from on high and could see myself in there, my family, the street on which I lived, and the great beyond. Looking down upon my life in this way, I felt all the bad emotions drain away. I felt a great peace flood through me. That night I flew in my dreams, somersaulted through the sky, felt all the soreness drain out of my limbs, and I flew all the way back to the lakes and watched the moon gleaming on the black expanses of water. That night I sensed that whenever I felt trapped in the house, I would be able to escape. That night in my dreams, I soared and soared and soared. Thank you.
Beautiful, thank you.
Thank you.
It's lovely to hear it. Okay, so the last question I'm going to ask everybody is, do you have a favourite woman writer on about nature? So I'm going to start with Claire for this one.
Yeah, I've got loads. Where do I start? I'm a big fan of Alice Fowler, who for a while was a columnist in The Guardian, but actually she's written some really, really wonderful books about kind of foraging and kind of making gardens and making edible gardens out of small things. She's a really wonderful and inspiring writer, and I'm going to sneak a second in there. The other one is Alice Vincent, who's now another Guardian columnist, actually, and not because I read The Guardian, I found them before that. And she also is very much about kind of enjoying your outside space, no matter what size it is, whether you've got a balcony, as she did for a while, and kind of connecting with nature through that, or kind of having your first garden, just kind of what it means to go out. And she does these wonderful things on Instagram where she goes out and does little tours, just walking around the garden, just noticing the changes. And yeah, I find both of them, those writers, very soothing on nature.
Okay, lovely, thank you. Monica, do you have a favourite?
Yes, I have a favourite author who writes about many things, including nature, and her name is Carmen Maria Machado, fiction writer. And in one of her short story collections, she has this incredible story where, she writes, it's two different stories, but in both of them she depicts the landscape around her as this very eerie, isolated, kind of misty, sinister place that everybody is escaping from and retreating. And she actually wrote about a massive pandemic happening and everybody having to like retreat and not communicate with each other. This was before the pandemic, so she has a bit of an oracle about her, but she writes about this like mist that takes over, and then she also writes about being in this house with a partner who is called Bad, who is an abusive partner, and the relationship between them, and how the house in this isolated place in a very specific area with one road and the trees in a very specific location, and she writes about it as if the nature outside is conspiring with Bad to keep her trapped there in really fantastic ways. So I recommend her work to anyone who's interested.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I've read some of her work.
I love it. Yeah, it's really good.
Fantastic. Anita, do you have a favourite?
Yeah, a couple I like out of many. It's hard to choose. Robin Wall Camara wrote a book called Gathering Moss and Braiding Sweetgrass. Writes about nature from looking at indigenous perspectives. There's a term which made me really think, well, more than human. We often think of ourselves as being superior to human, but superior to nature as humans, but actually in so many cultures around the world they see nature as more than human rather than less than human. And that made me think a lot in my understanding of nature. I also love Nan Shepherd. She wrote The Living Mountain. I've just been walking out in the Highlands and Islands and Hebrides, and she writes The Living Mountains, a really slim book about the Cairngorms. And again, she thinks from a more female perspective about our experiences with nature. For example, it's not all about just conquering the mountain, reaching the summit. It's more about those intimate experiences with entering the mountain and becoming kind of part of, feeling ourselves part of nature rather than just conquering nature.
Yeah, thank you. And it's lovely to hear Nan Shepherd's daughter. Thank you. Kate, do you have a favourite?
That's a terrifying question, given that I've made a book called Women on Nature. These are only voices that write about these islands, the East Atlantic archipelago, as we might think of it. And there are 117 voices in there, and then there are all the American voices, and so it's a massively difficult question. I also struggle with the notion of nature itself as other, and so for me, actually, the writers that I very much enjoy, like yourself, Anita, are those who don't really differentiate between our lives and the lives of the other creatures that we don't call human. And so to land in a safe historical place where I'm going to step back from those who are living in order to answer that question. I think Dorothy Wordsworth, I find her diaries, her journal, extraordinarily moving. And what Dorothy does is write about being outside as opposed to being inside. So it's not nature as such, it's the whole thing that is just not being inside. And actually Charlotte Brontë is for me just a superb, she really does, again, when all those passages where she writes about being outside are wonderful. But I am going to just throw out a sort of hurrah to a wonderful poet who died comparatively recently, who was probably America's best-selling poet, who is Mary Oliver. And I think Mary Oliver's work is so direct and so beautiful and so light and so sublime. When she went for walks in the woods, she used to hide pencils in the trees in case she had a moment of inspiration and she hadn't got anything on her. So she used to hide her stuff. And I think that Mary Oliver is an extraordinary voice who sort of transcends time and space.
She connects to so many people, doesn't she?
She does, yeah, across all kinds of people are moved by her work, which I think is sublime and yet is so direct and simple.
So as you say, you collated all these different pieces of writing about nature from many different women, some living and some alive. They're both the same, aren't they? Some living and some dead. So how did you go about that? I mean, obviously it's a huge topic, but I mean, why did you do it? And then...
Well, Unbound asked me if I'd do it, and I think they thought that I would just commission 12 people to write 12 essays, and that would be an anthology, or 15 people to write 15 essays, and that would be it. And it just didn't occur to me. It never entered my head, and so I just thought, actually, there were a few things going on. One, politically, I was irritated by the idea that nature writing is a sort of male prerogative, and originally a sort of American male prerogative, which then the English sort of took over and went with, which was largely people of privilege, people who were highly educated, people who had the time, the money and the resources to go out and do that. And it does only really go back a couple of 100 years, sort of Walden, Thoreau, that's sort of where it's all started. Although you can find other bits and pieces, I suppose Wordsworth, Coleridge, but that's still a couple of 100 years. And I just thought, no, I'm going to go back as far as I possibly can. And so I think the first autobiography published in English was Marjorie Kemp's book. And Marjorie Kemp had this fantastic description of being shipwrecked, blown off course. If that's not nature writing, I don't know what it's. Lost at sea, that's nature. And then her friend, Julian of Norwich, a mystic. This is about 1342-ish, I think. I'm a bit woolly on my date, so anybody who's a Julian of Norwich fan, remind me. So I started off with Julian of Norwich and Marjorie Kemp as the sort of linchpins. They were as far back as I could find. And then I just came forward, looking everywhere. And it was very hard to do because you can't just go into the British Library and look up 16th century nature writing women, because it wasn't perceived to be a thing. I was very fortunate in that my supervisor at Huddersfield, where I was doing a PhD, Todd Borlick, had just published this fantastic anthology of early modern writing about the natural world. And Todd was incredibly helpful in explaining to me how I might go about finding these voices. There's a sort of gap when I get to the 18th century, partly because I was happy once we got to the Victorians, and I was happy once we got to the 20th century. And there are about 70 living writers. But actually, I'd sort of been working from the 21st century backwards, and from the, from 700 years ago forwards. And there's this sort of gap in the 18th century when Unbound said, you have been doing this project for years, will you just give it to us? So the 18th century is there, but it's not quite, but people like Margaret Cavendish, who wrote a fantastic conversation about an oak tree and the man who was cutting it down, in which the oak tree sort of pled its cause as to please can I stay, please don't cut me down. And I think that was because somebody governmental wanted to cut all the oak trees down on her land to make ships to go and declare war on other people with. So it does get a bit patchy there, but that was sort of how I did it. And Anita was one of the very first people who came to me and said, I understand you're making this book. And that was how, I think you were more or less the first, I think you're the first living person who's in it.
Just about living. I'm feeling quite nostalgic now. So I think it was back in 2018 it first started crowdfunding.
Years ago.
Was it 5 years? 5 year anniversary? We should have the 5 year anniversary drink tonight.
Well, we should do,
because crowdfunding.
Because it sort of was, it happened in lockdown, and so the whole thing just sort of slipped under the carpet really, because it was none of us were allowed out of our houses, let alone having a launch party. And then we were going to have a launch party in Cumbria.
Let's do it.
And a tree blew down. Yeah. A tree blew down, so I had to cancel it because there was some massive storm, Storm Desmond. And
power of nature.
Nature's getting
so
in the way.
but we'll have the 5th anniversary. I think that's the best way to do it.
Yes, fantastic. So you're also a writer about nature yourself. You've written your own book, The Fish Ladder, which is a memoir and a book about nature writing. Is that
sort of? Yeah. I mean, I just wrote it, and then it sort of. I think it sort of was perceived as it's a sort of travelogue / nature writing / what else? Memoir. Those three things. I decided to follow a river from the sea to its source, based on a book by Nan Shepherd's good friend Neil Gunn. Although it was Neil Gunn who told her to put The Living Mountain under the bed for 30 years. So no one's going to want to read that, don't bother publishing it. And she may have struggled at that time, who knows. But yeah, so following the steps of a Scottish writer, I wanted to follow this river from the sea to the source, which I did. And The Fish Ladder is the story of how that came about and eventually happened.
And you're going to read a little bit from us tonight?
I am. Funny enough, there's not much nature in it, but you'll see why. You'll see why it's relevant. My mum at this point, my adopted mother, Jean, had just had a massive heart attack and to all intents and purposes died. A nurse came in and said they were preparing Mum's body, taking it to somewhere we could look at her, and would we please wait for a few moments. I phoned my husband Rupert in Barcelona and told him that Mum had died. The words sounded very strange to me. And then the doctor came back. "This is really very unusual," he said, his hands raised as though in blessing. "But your mother's heart has begun to beat of its own accord, although she is unable to breathe. We've put her on life support and are moving her to our critical care unit. If there is no improvement in 24 hours, we'll turn off the life support. In the meantime, we'll try and find out what has caused this." Critical care. I woke in darkness at my brother's house. I was in the spare bed in my nephew Connor's room. He was awake. "Connor, I'm going to go over to the hospital. Do you want to come?" "It's okay, I'll stay here and look after Evie, my daughter. I'll tell the others where you've gone." I drove to the hospital and parked Mum's car in the almost empty car park. Trees huffed and nodded. Blue streaks lightened the inky sky. A copy of Jane Eyre was tucked beneath my elbow. I made my way through the quiet corridors, their vinyl floors and fluttering fluorescents, and rang the buzzer outside the critical care unit. A nurse admitted me and then rejoined her colleagues sitting peaceably at their station. Mum and 2 other patients rested, each with their private, internal struggle, each mechanically suspended in a space held open between life and non-life. An opportunity, a place of choosing. Mum was all wired up with a tube taped to her nose. There were a lot of pipes. The rhythmic sound of her mechanically controlled breathing was like waves on an artificial beach. I pulled up a chair and leaned close to Mum's face. Ordinarily, she was deaf, and the life support had a range of noises all of its own. I had to lift my voice even to hear myself above it. I read the part where Jane Eyre frightens Mr. Rochester's horse, and he accuses her of being a fairy. Mum gave no indication of knowing that I was there, but the nurses were very appreciative. After a while, the man in the next bed, who had been in a coma, woke up. There was a choking and whirring as his lungs began to inflate of their own accord, causing a flutter of activity as he fought against the machinery, which suddenly threatened to smother him. Shortly afterwards, his wife arrived. He seemed to be trying to say something. His wife translated for him through his pipes and tubes. "He wants to know what you were reading," she said. "It was Jane Eyre." She looked nonplussed. "By Charlotte Brontë." "He very much enjoyed the story," she said. Her husband wheezed and rasped. He looked from me to my mum, "And he wants to know if you're going to come and read again tonight." Tonight. Mum's condition was to be reviewed at 4 o'clock that afternoon, and if there was no improvement, they would disconnect the breathing apparatus. "If I'm here, yes, certainly," I replied.
Okay. Okay, thank you all of you. That's been absolutely brilliant. I'm just going to see, have we got a few minutes for questions? Is that okay? Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to open it up to all of you now. So has anyone got any questions they'd like to ask our panellists? Anybody? No questions?
I haven't got a question, but I've just bought Claire's book. I didn't realise you'd be here, so I'm looking forward to reading that.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, brilliant. And if anyone wants to buy books from any of the panellists, there is a bookstore downstairs, I think, where you can buy them afterwards. Anything else anyone wants to add? Okay, well, in that case, we'll round up then. So thank you, all of you. Thank you, Claire and Monica and Anita and Kate. It's been really lovely talking to you all and really fantastic hearing you all read. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Anna, as well. Fantastic. such brilliant events lined up all of tomorrow and on Sunday as well. And we've got our welcome party happening at Cobbles from 8 p.m. till 10 p.m. now. So feel free to join us or go home and get ready for tomorrow's big festival day. But thank you again.
Brilliant.